There are moments in life that change everything. You think you have it all together, that you've built a solid and predictable path, but suddenly a single insight, a single previously hidden truth, can turn your world upside down. That's exactly what happened to Daniel Carter that ordinary afternoon when he decided to take a walk in the park to clear his head after years of building an empire. What he found there, however, was something no amount of fortune could have prepared him for. Have you ever stopped to think about what would happen if a mistake from the past came back to completely change your present? Could a single choice change not only your life, but also the lives of others in ways you never imagined? The answer is yes. There are decisions we make without realizing the impact they will have years later, and there are secrets that, when revealed, show how much we underestimate what really matters. Daniel was no ordinary man. At 38, he had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of: success, money, recognition. His technology company was present on 3 continents. Business magazines featured his photo on the cover, and investors vied for his attention. But, as strange as it may seem, something inside him was not complete. That was why, when he returned to Mexico City, where he grew up, he felt an emptiness that was hard to explain. And without knowing why, that late afternoon he decided to go to Chapultepec Park to try to find some peace. The sun painted the sky in orange tones as he walked through the trees. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the sound of the wind and the distant laughter of families ease his mind, which was burdened with decisions and business. But then something broke his tranquility. The sound of a guitar, a soft melody, accompanied by a female voice that sounded strangely familiar to him. Curious, he followed the sound until he found the scene that would change his life forever. A woman was singing, sitting on the edge of a fountain, and next to her 3 small children were playing innocently. Daniel's heart raced. He knew that woman, and those childlike faces. They were identical to his. For a moment, Daniel froze. His brain tried to find logical explanations for what he saw, but nothing made sense. The woman was Olivia, his ex-wife. He hadn't seen her in 5 years, ever since he made the decision to leave everything behind and move to the United States. But that wasn't the only thing that paralyzed him. The 3 little ones next to her had unmistakable features. The shape of their eyes, the way one of them frowned, concentrating on a drawing on the floor, the crooked smile of the other, the curious expression of the youngest girl. They were copies of him. They were his children. He felt like he was gasping for air. His chest rose and fell unevenly as Daniel tried to reason. How was this possible? How had Olivia never told him? He remembered when they had broken up. She had cried. He had said he couldn't hold on, that he needed to leave to build something bigger, but never ever had she mentioned being pregnant. She had never sent a message, a letter, a call, or had she? Daniel felt a cold shiver run down his spine when he realized that, in the first few months after his departure, his assistant had filtered all his personal messages. Had he ignored the biggest truth of his life without even realizing it? Olivia noticed her presence. For a moment her face reflected pure shock, as if she had seen a ghost. The music stopped, and the silence that followed seemed even more deafening than any melody. The 3 little ones noticed their mother's reaction and, curious, followed her gaze to the man in the impeccable suit standing there, open-mouthed. One of the boys, the quietest, tilted his head and frowned, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet when the girl, with her sweet and innocent voice, asked, "Mommy, why does that man look so much like Nicholas?" Time seemed to slow down. Olivia, visibly tense, began to gather her belongings in a hurry. She was going to run away. Daniel saw his children before him for the first time, and he couldn't let them disappear as if this moment had never happened. His voice was out before he could think. "Olivia, wait!" She hesitated. Her gaze was filled with hurt, resentment, and something else, fear. But for some reason, she stopped. And in that moment, Daniel knew he could no longer run from the truth. He had children, 3, and he needed to know everything. Olivia pressed her lips together, clearly struggling with herself. Daniel could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of him wanted to disappear, to run away from this inevitable conversation, but another part knew that this was a truth that could no longer be hidden. The years of silence were over. She looked at her children and then back at him, taking a deep breath before saying in a cool but controlled tone, "Not now, Daniel. The children are tired." The children, those 3 little lives who had his blood, his genetics, but who grew up without even knowing who he was. Daniel didn't know what hurt more, the fact that Olivia had hidden his existence from them, or the fact that perhaps he had dug this abyss himself when he chose his career above all else. But now he was here, and he wasn't going to leave without answers. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." Daniel's voice came out hoarser than he intended. Olivia hesitated, glancing at her children. Matteo, the most serious, was absently leafing through a children's book, but his eyes were alert and scanning the tension in the air. Nicholas, the most agitated, was still holding the soccer ball that seemed to be his faithful companion. Valentina, the youngest, stared at Daniel without fear, with genuine curiosity. None of them seemed to know who he was. None of them seemed to miss him. And that realization hit hard. Olivia sighed and finally gave in. "Okay, but not here. If you want to talk, meet me at my house tomorrow, alone." And then, without waiting for an answer, she took the little ones by the hand and began to walk away. Daniel stood there, paralyzed, watching them disappear into the crowd. His world, his reality, everything he thought he knew about his life had just crumbled before his eyes. Daniel spent the night unable to sleep. How was it possible that he had 3 children and was only discovering it now? Every time he tried to close his eyes, the image of the children came back to him. Matteo, with his watchful, calculating gaze, Nicholas, always on the move, and Valentina, the youngest, with her innocent curiosity. They had names, they had personalities, they had lives, and he was not part of it. For the first time, Daniel wondered what he had missed in those years. His first cry, his first step, his first word. How many nights had Olivia spent awake caring for them? How many birthdays had he missed? A pang of guilt settled in his chest, stronger than any failure he had ever faced in the business world. He was a stranger to his own children, and now he had only one option: to try to make up for lost time. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the address Olivia had sent him. He had expected a middle-class building, perhaps something modest, but well-structured. However, what he found was an old building, without an elevator, with peeling walls and an iron gate that creaked when opened. He climbed the steps to the 5th floor, feeling suffocated with each flight. Was this where she had raised her children alone? He, living in luxurious penthouses, traveling in private jets, while Olivia spent sleepless nights in that small, cramped apartment? He took a deep breath before knocking on the door. A soft footstep sounded from the other side. The door opened slowly, revealing Olivia with an unreadable expression. There was no anger, no emotion evident, only a deep weariness. "Come in." Her voice was neutral, without any hint of intimacy. Daniel obeyed. He felt he was about to hear the truth that would forever change the way he viewed his own life. The apartment was small but impeccably organized. The walls were covered with children's drawings, shelves with books and toys arranged in colorful boxes. There was a modest dining table with 4 mismatched chairs and a worn but clean sofa. There was no luxury, but there was life. There was love. And Daniel felt a knot in his stomach as he realized that he had never been part of that world. "Tell me." Olivia crossed her arms and leaned against the kitchen sink, bluntly. "Tell me what you want to know." Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of absence in his words. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" His voice came out firmer than he expected. "Why did I have to find out like this, in the middle of the street?" Olivia let out a bitter laugh. "You think I didn't try?" She stepped away from the sink and grabbed a small box from the bookshelf. She tossed it onto the table. Daniel's eyes widened when he saw what was inside. Letters. Lots of them, all addressed to him. Some were crumpled, some still unopened. "Over 50, Olivia said, her voice thick with weariness. "Texts, emails, phone calls. I've been to your office 6 times. Your assistant always had the same answer. Mr. Carter is busy. Mr. Carter is in a meeting. Mr. Carter is out of the country." Daniel stared at the letters, feeling the crushing weight of the truth. For years, he had thought he was in control of his own life, but in reality, he had been a puppet of his own ambition. He had trusted his filters, his assistants, his shielded life so much that he never realized that on the other side was someone trying to tell him that he was a father. Daniel felt a bitter taste in his mouth. How many times had he walked past his assistant without even asking what she was filtering? How many opportunities had he had to find out the truth and simply ignored them? He vaguely remembered emails he had never opened, messages he had archived, messages he had considered irrelevant. And now here he was, faced with the consequences of his own negligence. "I didn't know." Daniel's voice came out quieter than he intended. "If I had, I would have come back." But as soon as the words were out, he realized how hollow they sounded. Olivia laughed lightly, humorlessly, and crossed her arms. "Would you have, Daniel? Or would you have found an excuse? Would you have said it wasn't the right time, that your company needed you, that you couldn't lose focus?" The worst part was that she was right. He knew himself. He knew that 5 years ago he wouldn't have dropped everything to be a father. He would have said he couldn't, that he had bigger plans, that he would sort it out later. But now, looking at that apartment, at the pile of unread letters, at the woman who had raised 3 children alone while he became a tycoon, the only thing he could feel was shame. "Do they know?" he asked, swallowing hard. "Do they know who I am?" Olivia pressed her lips together, looking away. "They know their father isn't around, that it's always been just me." Her tone was neutral, But Daniel felt the weight of those words like a punch. To his children, he wasn't an absence. He simply didn't exist. Daniel ran his hand over his face, trying to process it all. There was no version of this story where he came out as innocent. The weight of the years of absence, of the involuntary neglect, of the excuses he never had to make because he never knew he had to. It was all there, wide open before him. But above all, what bothered him the most was one single question. What would he do now? "What now?" he asked, breaking the silence. "What do I do with this, Olivia? What do you expect me to do?" Olivia took a deep breath, crossing her arms as if to protect herself. "I don't expect anything from you, Daniel. I don't expect you to take on a father role overnight. I don't expect you to try to fix what's already broken, but now that you know, that's your decision." Decision. The word echoed in his head. For years he had been making decisions to close million-dollar contracts, open new offices, expand his company, but none of those choices had as much weight as this one. He could simply walk away, pretend he never knew, go back to his comfortable world where there was only work and goals to meet. Or he could stay, try, even. Though he knew it wouldn't be easy, he looked up and met Olivia's gaze. "I want to meet them," he said firmly. "I don't want to be just another name lost in their history. I want them to know who I am. I want them to know that I'm here now." Olivia studied him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if he meant what he said. Finally, she sighed. "Then you're going to have to earn it, Daniel." Daniel nodded slowly. He knew Olivia wasn't exaggerating. It wasn't enough to just show up and expect the kids to accept him with open arms. He wasn't a hero returning home. He was an outsider trying to enter a life that had gone on without him. And that hurt more than any business defeat. "I'll earn it," he said. And for once he wasn't promising something to an investor or a board of directors. He was promising himself. Olivia sighed and looked at her watch. "They'll be home from school in an hour." The information took Daniel by surprise. He hadn't thought about it. School, routine, homework, schedules. Those three little ones had their own world, full of rules he didn't know about. Olivia picked up a dish towel and began mechanically drying a glass, without looking at him. "If you want to stay, you can wait for them. But don't expect them to run to hug you." Daniel felt the tension in his chest grow. Stay. He didn't know if he was ready for that. But at the same time, he knew that if he walked out that door now, he might never have the courage to come back. So he took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll stay." Olivia didn't answer, just finished what she was doing and went to her room. He was alone now, in this small apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life that should have been his. He walked slowly to one of the bookshelves and picked up a framed drawing. 3 children holding a woman's hands. The caption, written in childish handwriting, read, "My family." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. There, on that small piece of paper, was the stark truth. He was not part of that picture. Time seemed to drag as Daniel waited. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been so nervous. $1 million negotiations, corporate mergers, pitches to hundreds of investors. None of them had made him as restless as the moment he was about to experience. He looked around the apartment, trying to take in every detail. The simple furniture, the toys organized in colorful boxes, the doodles on the walls. Everything about it screamed home, but it wasn't a home he knew. The sound of the door opening made him hold his breath. Children's voices echoed through the small hallway. First laughter, then hurried footsteps. "Mom, today at school I drew a giant dinosaur." The excited voice belonged to Nicholas. "And the teacher said that Matteo reads like an older child," Valentina added. Daniel froze, feeling his heart race. They were there. Then the three of them entered the living room. Matteo was the first to notice that there was a stranger in the apartment. He frowned, gripping the strap of his backpack tightly. Nicholas stopped right behind him, and Valentina, always the most expressive, tilted her head curiously. "Mommy, who is this man?" she asked bluntly. Olivia glanced at Daniel before answering. "He's a friend of Mommy's." Her answer was measured, cautious. Daniel understood immediately. She didn't want the children to see him as anything more than a visitor. Not yet. Daniel cleared his throat, his palms sweating. "Hi," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'm Daniel." The children continued to stare at him, emotionless. He waited for some reaction, curiosity, excitement, anything, but all he got was a charged silence. In that moment he realized the magnitude of the challenge he faced. The silence in the room grew heavy. Daniel had never felt so small in front of three children. He tried to smile, but Matteo kept his expression serious. Nicolas looked away, and Valentina just watched him, as if trying to decipher him. He had expected a rough start, but he was not prepared for complete indifference. Olivia broke the silence. "Go wash your hands, and then we'll talk about our day." The children obeyed without question, walking past Daniel as if he were invisible. That hurt. He didn't know what he'd expected. A hug, a smile, a shy hello. But now he realized that to them, he was just a stranger sitting on the couch. When they were alone, Daniel let out a heavy sigh. "They hate me." The sentence slipped out before he could stop. "It." Olivia looked at him skeptically and crossed her arms. "They don't hate you, Daniel. They just don't know you." She took a deep breath, then added, "What did you expect? That you'd just walk in here and suddenly everything would be over? That they'd just run to call you Dad?" Daniel hung his head. She was right. He wanted to believe that an apology, a sincere explanation, would be enough to fix what years of absence had broken. But that wasn't how it worked. If he wanted to be part of this family, he would have to start from scratch, and that meant earning the trust of his own children, one day at a time. Dinner was held in a strange atmosphere. Daniel sat at the table, but he was clearly not part of the routine. Olivia served the dishes with the naturalness of someone who did this every day, asked about school, helped Matteo cut the meat, reminded Nicolas not to talk with his mouth full. It was a perfect family scene, except he was the one out of place. He tried to make conversation. "So, Matteo, what do you like to read?" The boy looked up at him for a second before answering shortly. "Books." Nicholas, who seemed less suspicious, looked at Daniel and asked with his mouth full, "Why does your watch glow like that?" Olivia's look immediately reprimanded him for his behavior, but Daniel smiled for the first time. "It's a special watch. It helps me tell the time in the dark." Valentina, who had been observing the conversation without participating, finally spoke. "Nicholas' watch also glows, but it's Ben 10's. The comment made Daniel laugh, and he answered sincerely, "Then I think his is even more special than mine." For the first time, he saw a small smile appear on the girl's face. It was a quick moment, but enough for Daniel to realize that this was the way to go. No rush, no forcing anything, just being present. When dinner was over, Olivia started to clear the plates, but Daniel stepped in first. "Let me help." Olivia hesitated for a second before handing the plates to him. It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning. In Daniel's world, he was used to giving orders, delegating tasks, being waited on. But in this apartment, at this table, he had to learn to just be a father. After dinner, Olivia called the children to get ready for bed. Daniel watched as each one followed their routine with a discipline he hadn't expected. Matteo organized his books on the table, Nicholas put the soccer ball in a box next to the couch, and Valentina picked up her crayons without being asked. It was a well-oiled system, a small world working in perfect harmony, a world he had never been a part of. When the children went to their rooms, Daniel stood there, not knowing what to do. Should he leave? Stay a little longer? Wait for Olivia to come back? Before he could decide, he heard a soft voice coming from the hallway. "Mommy reads us stories before bed." He turned and saw Valentina in the bedroom doorway, holding a colorful book. Her big brown eyes watched him curiously. Olivia came up behind the girl and crossed her arms. They liked to hear a bedtime story. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it was clear that this was an established routine. Daniel understood what she meant. This was her space, her connection to the children. Could he be a part of it? He looked at Valentina, then at Olivia. "Can I read to them today?" The question was out before he could think twice. There was silence for a moment, and then, to his surprise, Olivia sighed and stepped aside, allowing him to enter the room. "Ask them," she said, leaving the decision up to the children. Daniel looked at the three of them, waiting for an answer. Matteo and Nicholas exchanged quick glances, as if trying to silently decide whether to accept the proposal. Valentina, however, was more direct. She handed the book to Daniel and said, "If you know how to do the funny voices, you can read it." It was a small test, but to Daniel it felt like a big step forward. He took the book carefully and sat on the edge of Nicholas's bed, feeling a strange nervousness for someone used to speaking in public. He opened the book and began to read. The story was simple, about an adventurous rabbit who wanted to explore the world. But what really mattered was not the plot, but the way he told it. He tried to make a high-pitched voice for the rabbit, a high-pitched voice for the bear, and a strange voice for the wise owl. At first, the three of them just watched. But then Valentina giggled. Then Nicolas laughed too. And finally even Matteo, the most serious one, let out a small smile. When he finished the story, he closed the book and looked at the three of them. "I think I got the voices right," he asked, trying to sound casual. Valentina nodded. "You were funny. But Mom can do it better." Daniel smiled. He hadn't expected to beat Olivia in the storytelling department, but at least now he was part of the tradition. Olivia, who had been watching from the doorway, seemed less tense than before. "Time for bed," she said, and the children settled into their beds. As he tucked them in, Daniel felt a strange sensation, a mixture of happiness and fear. For once, there was no intruder, but there was still a long way to go. When he left the room, Daniel felt that his presence there was still fragile. He didn't know what would come next, but that night was a small first step. Olivia walked him to the door without saying much. The silence between them was no longer as heavy, but it still carried a history of hurt and lost years. She didn't kick him out, but she didn't invite him back either. Before leaving, Daniel turned to her. "Can I come back tomorrow?" His voice was firm, But inside him, insecurity was eating away at him. Olivia took a few seconds before answering. "This isn't about what you want, Daniel. This is about what they need. If you're going to come back for them, not for yourself." The answer hit hard, but it was fair. If he wanted to be a father, it wasn't enough to just show up. He had to prove himself day after day. He nodded, accepting the rules of the game. "I'll be back tomorrow." And then he left, feeling that for the first time in years he was headed in the right direction. The elevator was broken, so he walked down the 5 floors, step by step, as he knew he would have to do with his children. Outside, the cool night air hit his face. He grabbed his phone and, without thinking much, opened his calendar. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., he blocked out a time. Visit Matteo, Nicholas, and Valentina. For the first time, his children were his priority, and this time, he wouldn't keep them waiting. The next afternoon, Daniel parked his car in front of Olivia's apartment building. He had never felt so nervous about a simple visit. He adjusted his watch, ran his hands through his hair, and took a deep breath. This time it wasn't a contract he was negotiating. This was his chance to earn his children's trust. He climbed the 5 flights of stairs faster than he had the day before. This time, he wasn't a stranger trying to figure out what he had missed. He wanted to be a part of it. He knocked on the door and waited. He heard small footsteps on the other side, excited voices, and then the door opened. Nicholas was the first to appear. This time he didn't look away. He just studied him, holding his soccer ball. "You're back." Daniel forced a smile. "I told you I'd be back." Nicholas thought for a moment, and then shrugged. "Do you want to play?" The question was asked casually, almost like a test. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Sure, but I'll warn you right now, I'm terrible." The boy's face lit up with a small smile before he ran down the hallway. Daniel took a step inside. He still had a long way to go, but that invitation, as simple as it was, meant everything. Matteo and Valentina peered out from the living room. The suspicion was still there, but something had changed. Daniel realized it wasn't about grand gestures or well-chosen words. It was about being there, about coming back, about no longer being the man who once left. The ball bounced on the ground a few times before Nicholas kicked it to Daniel. The impact was greater than he expected, and he had to steady himself to avoid tripping. Nicholas' spontaneous laughter was the first big victory of the day. "You're really bad at this," the boy commented without malice, and Daniel laughed along. "I warned you." While they played in the small space of the living room, Matteo and Valentina gradually got closer. The older boy observed everything with his analytical gaze, as if trying to understand who this man was, who was suddenly part of his home. Valentina, on the other hand, held a piece of crayon in her hand, drawing something in a notebook on the floor. "What are you drawing?" Daniel asked, trying to include the girl in the conversation. She looked at him, thought for a moment, and silently turned the sketchbook toward him. It was a drawing of 4 people, 3 children holding a woman's hand, similar to the one he had seen on the bookshelf the day before. But this time, there was something different. Beside them was a tall, dark-haired man, drawn with uncertain lines, as if he had been placed there recently. Daniel swallowed hard. That drawing was worth more than any words. It wasn't a direct invitation, but it was a beginning. He was there, on paper, in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to be in her children's hearts too. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he looked at the drawing. It was just a childish sketch, but to him it meant the world to him. He wanted to say something, but he realized that any words could ruin this moment. So he simply looked at Valentina and smiled. It turned out amazing. She shrugged, as if it were no big deal, but kept the drawing close to her. protecting it. Matteo, who had been watching the interaction until then, finally spoke. "Are you going to keep coming?" The question was direct, no beating around the bush. Daniel knew the answer couldn't be vague or evasive. "Yes," he replied, looking the boy in the eye. "I know I wasn't here before, but I am now, and I'm not going anywhere else." Matteo studied Daniel for a few seconds, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Then he simply nodded and went back to his books. It wasn't an immediate acceptance, nor a grand gesture of trust, but it was a sign. Matteo was beginning to believe. Olivia, who was watching from the kitchen, sighed softly. Daniel realized that even if his children were starting to accept him, there was still another barrier to be broken. It wasn't enough to prove to the children that he was here to stay. He also needed to prove it to Olivia. Night fell, and with it came the family routine that Daniel was slowly beginning to understand. Matteo was hunched over a book, Nicolas was trying to balance the ball on his feet without knocking anything over, and Valentina was now coloring the drawing she had made. Olivia moved around the kitchen with the precision of someone who had repeated those steps for years. Everyone had their role there, except him. "Are you staying for dinner?" The question came from Olivia, without emotion, but also without coldness, just a matter of fact, as if she were testing the limits of this new dynamic. Daniel looked at the children, then back at her. "If that's okay." Olivia didn't answer right away, but finally gave a slight nod. "Then set the table." Daniel picked up the plates and silverware, feeling ridiculously insecure about something so simple. He was used to deciding business mergers, but here, in that moment, the simple act of putting a spoon in the right place felt like a test of adaptation. He wondered how many times Olivia had done this alone, organizing every detail for her children without anyone to help her. He felt ashamed that he had never been there before. The children sat down and began to eat, between comments about their day and small disputes over who would speak first. This time Daniel didn't feel like a complete stranger at the table. He was still an intruder in this well-structured world, but now there was a place for him, small, fragile, but real. The conversation at the table followed its natural rhythm, and Daniel noticed something interesting. The children were starting to include him. Nicholas, the most spontaneous, asked direct questions about what he did. "What do you do for a living?" Daniel thought about his answer. He could talk about technology, about his companies, about numbers and investments. But looking at his children, he realized that none of that mattered here. "I solve problems," he answered, simplifying. Matteo frowned. "What kind of problems?" Daniel shrugged. "It depends. Today, for example, I had to figure out how to set the table without making any mistakes," he said, feigning seriousness. The comment made Nicholas laugh, and even Matteo smile. Small advances. Valentina just watched him, without saying anything, but Daniel noticed that she was drawing something new in her notebook. The meal ended, and Olivia began to clear the dishes. "I'll help," Daniel said before she could protest. She hesitated, but didn't refuse. As she washed the dishes, Daniel felt the tension between them ease, if only a little. "You're doing better than I thought you would," Olivia commented, not looking at him. Daniel smirked. "Well, if there's one thing I've learned in business, it's that when you really want something, you have to be patient." Olivia dried a plate and finally looked at him. "And what exactly do you want, Daniel?" He held her gaze and answered without hesitation. "I want to be a father, not a visitor." Olivia was silent for a moment, studying Daniel as if trying to figure out if his words were really true. "It's not just up to me," she said, putting the last plate in the drainer. "They have to want you to be a part of their lives." Daniel nodded. He knew he couldn't demand anything. He could only show day after day that he was here to stay. When he returned to the classroom, he found the children finishing their activities. Matteo was reading in silence, Nicolas was playing with his ball, and Valentina was doodling in her notebook. It was then that something caught his attention. In the corner of the drawing, next to the figure of the man she had added, Valentina wrote something small, almost shy. "Daddy?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't called him that, hadn't said anything, but the simple fact of having written that was already a huge step. He swallowed hard and tried to act normal. He didn't want to pressure her, didn't want her to feel like she had to call him Dad before she was ready. But this moment, however small, meant a lot. It was the first time either of the children had shown, even in a subtle way, that they were beginning to accept him. Daniel looked at Olivia, who had also seen the drawing. She didn't say anything, but her eyes softened as if she understood the weight of that small gesture. Then, for the first time that night, she didn't look tense or defensive, just tired. "Tomorrow is a new day," she said softly. Daniel knew this was more than a comment about the weather. It was a chance to keep trying. That night, as he walked back to his car, Daniel felt something different. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his company, meetings, or profits. His mind was filled with colorful drawings, shy laughter, direct questions, and curious looks. For the first time, he felt like he had something bigger to build than any business empire. Over the next few days, he came back. Every day. No grandiose announcements, no empty promises, just being there. At first, Matteo kept his distance, Nicolas was more receptive, and Valentina just watched. But over time, the barriers began to fall. He helped with homework, played soccer in the living room, listened to Olivia's stories about the challenges she faced alone. Each day was a new brick in the reconstruction of something he didn't even know he needed. And then it happened. One night, as he was saying goodbye, Valentina ran up to him and hugged him. A small gesture, but one that carried a lot of meaning. Daniel froze for a moment, feeling the warmth of her small arms around his waist. He closed his eyes for a second, absorbing the moment. When he pulled away, he saw Olivia watching the scene. She didn't say anything, but a small smile appeared on her lips. Trust was being rebuilt. The following week, it was Nicolas' turn. "Are you coming to my game on Saturday?" he asked casually as he kicked the ball against the wall. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Sure." Matteo was the last to give in, but when he did, it was in the most unexpected way. He simply pulled up a chair and placed it next to his while he read a book. He didn't say anything. He just accepted him there, as part of the routine. And, for Daniel, that meant more than any words. Looking back, he knew nothing would make up for the lost time. But what really mattered wasn't what was left behind. It was what he was building now. For the first time in years, he understood the true meaning of success. It wasn't in the numbers, the contracts, the recognition. It was in the family he was finally learning to have. Quote of the day: "True success is not in what you achieve, but in who you decide to be there for." If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and turn on notifications. Comment here which city you're watching from. We want to hear from you.